Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to our Wednesday, the Leading Change episode, this week with Salvatore Rinaldo. Hey Salvatore, welcome back.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me.
So Salvatore, on Wednesdays we want to dive into the stormy waters of change, of course, and the take we usually take here on the podcast is, of course, that as Scrum Masters, we need to be involved in that change and we need to be able to lead that change. It could be a team level, organizational level, or even individual level change. So we want to hear one of those stories. Salvatore, one change process you were involved with, and walk us through the story, but also highlight for us the tips, the tricks, the tools, the techniques you learned back then that you still apply today.
Absolutely. I'll try and do my best. So a few years ago, I was an Agile coach working in a small team of coaches, a very high profile team, I have to say. And we were part of a much wider transformation effort that was happening in this large UK bank where I was working. So as a small team of coaches, the way that we were engaging with our business units around the bank was that essentially sponsors and leaders from these business units would call us in and ask for help when they had specific challenges that they thought Agile coaches could help with. So they would use us mostly as facilitators, I would say, and they would help us, they would ask us to help around organizing workshops, organizing scaled planning sessions or big retrospective sessions. And this was fine, obviously this was part of our role as Agile coaches and facilitators. But we noticed very early in the process that by engaging with business units this way, we were lacking, impact. We were not making the impact that we thought we should make as Agile coaches, which was really to transform the organization and to go back to first principles and look at the structures, the culture, the mindset, the processes. We would almost assume that essentially the goal of the transformation was to apply Agile practices like the Scrum events or Kanban things around the block, rather than actually looking at the mindset change and the shift that needed to happen. So we realized after a couple of not very successful gigs with some of our business units, and these business units were quite big, they were almost companies in their own right. They would consist of a few hundred to a few thousand people trying to do specific things for this large bank. And so very soon in the process, we got together with my fellow coaches, and we realized that we needed to take some risks and we needed to go outside the playbook a little bit. As Agile coaches, we shouldn't just be facilitators. We should actually lead change. And to do that, we should liaise with our sponsors and leaders in these business units much earlier in the process. One of the reasons...
kind of introducing that idea of the mindset change that was necessary, right? Like, so instead of expecting them to come to you with everything they thought you could help with, you would have the opportunity to go to them and work with them to find areas where you thought you could help with, right? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely, 100%. It had to be much more client-led, and it had to be much more focused on coaching, rather than us telling them what Agile is all about and why they should apply it. We almost took Agile as a starting point, whereas it needs to be an arrival point. So we would work with these leaders to really step back, visualize their system, and use things like, value chain mapping, impact mapping, stakeholder mapping even. Sometimes we would ask these leaders, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Let's go back to, who your customers are. Let's map your business as if we were starting today. Now let's see how your structure and your organization and your roles are aligned to best deliver the value that you want to deliver to your customers. And let's also assess your capacity. Often these business units, in my opinion, were overestimating how much work they could get done. They were, drowning in work in progress, and therefore their cycle time tend to be quite long. So we try to work with leaders to step away from Agile practices and really look at their system. They were their own company, their own organization. And we would look at backlogs, we would look at what needed to be done and organize the work before trying to organize the people around the work. And that's something that really resonates with these leaders, because they could see that whatever we were suggesting was actually aligned to their goals. And so this way we had a much better chance of later introducing agile practices, because they would fall right in place in the right system. So first we change a system, right? We talk about system thinking and systems a lot, but I think as agile coaches, we really have to work at that level to reorganize things around the work that needs to be done, so that the agile adoption is much more, it's easier to implement, but it's also easier to stick.
One aspect that you mentioned there, I want to kind of explore a little bit further, because I think we need to kind of build a little bit of muscle around that bone, or that skeleton, which is the idea of a system. And you talked about working with these leaders to first clarify what they want to achieve, and then trying to map out, okay, so your organization is here and you're trying to achieve this. Where do you see the gaps and where might you want to change? And one of the things that is important for us as Scrum Masters is to recognize that a system is, well, it's an infinite number of aspects, right? Mm-hmm. We can't take into account an infinite number of aspects. We kind of need to focus on a few aspects. So I want you to walk us through how you did that with the leaders, and also what you considered as Agile coaches working with these business unit leaders. What were the aspects you brought into this overall term of the system?
Right. So the first kind of focus that we're trying to bring as coaches was, what is the goal? Let's work it back from there. But then the other aspect, which I think is very important, and you touched on this right now, is around constraints. It doesn't matter how complicated your system is, and it doesn't matter how many different paths value can take in your system. You will have bottlenecks. You will have constraints. Try to prioritize it by the constraints that you need to address. Go with the first one. And then you'll see that the constraint moves elsewhere. And eventually, if you do a very good job and your flow is optimized, your constraint will move to the market. And that's where you don't have a problem anymore, because that means you have almost infinite possibilities to satisfy your customer. This is why starting with the customer and with the outcomes that you want to realize is so important, is so vital.
Yeah, and that also highlights the aspect that the system is all the way up to the market. Now, it's not everything that you could consider, but it's all the way up to the market. And that scope of understanding is very important, because you said at some point the constraint will move elsewhere. It might move outside product development. It might move into service delivery. It might move into reach or marketing. It might move into the market itself, right? So it's important to understand that when we look at the system, we're trying to look at everything that happens from the moment something, some idea is accepted, okay, we must do this, all the way to a customer benefiting from it, and all the steps in between, right? And that's why it's so important to look at how is the organization set up, right? Because you can't even find the constraints if you don't even have a picture of how the organization is set up.
Absolutely, 100%. And something else that's really interesting, and it happens when the constraint moves out of your market, of your operations into the market, is that now as an operation, you're no longer suffering from exceeding demand. Your headache is no longer, how do I multiply my capacity so that I can satisfy demand? Now you can influence that demand, and maybe you can even create demand that the market doesn't have yet and your customer doesn't know exists, and which is essentially what all the big successful players in the tech market have done in the last 10 years, right? You name it.
Yeah, absolutely. And where innovation makes sense, right? So instead of making the teams even more busy with new ideas, it's rather help or go through what the market can take and innovate through offering different things, instead of being so busy that you don't even have time to take on the new ideas.
Absolutely. You can simplify and refine your value proposition design.
And all of this systems thinking and constraints that we talked about, of course, one great reference is the book we talked about yesterday, The Goal by Elia Goldratt, and also The Theory of Constraints. And I'll put the link on the show notes for people to go out and check out the tools behind those book and Theory of Constraints. Thank you for sharing this with us, Salvatore.
Thank you guys very much.
Leading change is one of the core skills we must acquire, but it is only one of the steps towards our success as Scrum Masters. Tomorrow, on Success Thursday, we will talk about how to define success for the Scrum Master role. We'll cover tips on how to measure your way to that position, and most importantly, how to develop that focus on continuous improvement that is as important for Scrum Masters as it is for teams. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.